My name is Father Michael, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been devoted to serving God in the embrace of the Catholic Church. Every day was filled with prayer, rituals, and the solemn responsibility of shepherding my congregation. I took pride in my role, in the sacraments I administered, and in the sacred texts I studied. Yet, as I stand here now, looking back on my life, I realize that the path I once walked was only the beginning of a much greater journey, one that would change everything I thought I knew about faith, salvation, and grace. My story begins in the quiet corridors of a Catholic seminary where I spent my formative years. I was only a child when I first walked through its towering doors, clutching my parents' hands with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The seminary was a world unto itself, filled with the smell of old books, the sound of whispered prayers, and the light of flickering candles. Here, I immersed myself in theology and canon law, poring over scripture late into the night. Even as a boy, I felt a deep passion for understanding the mysteries of God. I wanted to know Him, to serve Him, to dedicate my life to His will. As I grew older, my calling to the priesthood became undeniable. I felt chosen, set apart for a divine purpose. The day I was ordained, I stood before the altar with trembling hands and a heart full of promise. I pledged to be a good shepherd, to guide my flock with wisdom and compassion. I threw myself into my ministry with fervor, determined to embody the perfection I believed was required to serve God. Every homily, every confession, every baptism was an opportunity to fulfill my sacred duty. I believed that if I worked hard enough, prayed long enough, and adhered strictly enough to the Church's teachings, I would be worthy of my calling. Yet, even in the midst of my devotion, a shadow began to creep into my soul. It was subtle at first, a quiet unease that surfaced in the stillness of the night. Despite my prayers and my service, I felt a growing emptiness within me, a void I couldn't explain. I began to ask myself questions I had never dared to ask before. Was I truly close to God? Was He pleased with me? And why, despite everything I did I feel so far from Him? The more I searched for answers, the more the emptiness grew, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Over time, my prayers became routine, mere words spoken out of obligation rather than faith. I knelt before the altar, but my heart felt distant, as though my pleas were lost in the silence of the heavens. I began to doubt, not just myself, but the very foundations of my faith. Was I truly living for God, or was I merely going through the motions? My life, once filled with purpose, began to feel like a series of rituals devoid of meaning. And though I hid my struggles from my congregation, the fear of being a fraud gnawed at me relentlessly. I tried to push the doubts aside, to bury them beneath layers of discipline and devotion. But no matter how hard I tried, they refused to be silenced. I started to feel as though my life was a loop, repeating the same actions over and over without ever moving forward. I performed the Mass, recited the liturgy, and counseled my parishioners, but inside, I was lost. The fear that I wasn't good enough, that I could never truly earn God's approval, consumed me. And so, I labored harder, hoping that my efforts would fill the void, but they only deepened it. Sleepless nights became my companion, my mind racing with anxiety and doubt. I would stare at the ceiling of my room, feeling as though something was closing in on me. A sense of impending doom began to take hold, a conviction that I was missing something crucial, something that could not be found in the routines of my daily life. I felt trapped, unable to move forward yet unwilling to let go of the life I had built. The world around me grew gray, and even the beauty of the Church's rituals could no longer lift my spirit. One afternoon, desperate for clarity, I went for a walk in the woods near the parish. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. As I wandered through the trees, my thoughts swirled with questions and fears. Was this all there was? Had I given my life to a faith that I couldn't even feel anymore? The first drops of rain began to fall, and I looked up to see storm clouds rolling in. The wind picked up, and I realized I needed to find shelter, but it was too late. The storm was upon me. The rain fell in torrents, and I stumbled over the uneven ground, trying to find my way back. Lightning split the sky, and thunder roared in my ears. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I tumbled down a steep slope. I landed hard, my head striking a jagged rock. Pain shot through me, and then everything went black. When I awoke, or perhaps when I stopped being awake, I felt an overwhelming sense of weightlessness. The pain was gone, replaced by an indescribable peace. I realized with startling clarity that I was no longer in my body. I looked down and saw myself lying motionless on the ground, rain pooling around me. Yet, I felt no fear, only a profound calm. It was as though the burdens I had carried my entire life had been lifted in an instant. I became aware of a presence, a pull, drawing me away from my earthly self. Darkness surrounded me, but in the distance, I saw a light, brilliant and warm, unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't just a light, it was a presence, a beckoning. I felt myself moving toward it, not walking but being drawn, as though my soul recognized it and longed to be near it. The closer I came, the more the darkness faded, and with it, all my fears and doubts. I moved through what I can only describe as a tunnel, a passageway that seemed to lead beyond time and space. Everything I had worried about, my failures, my inadequacies, my struggles, melted away, leaving only a sense of awe and anticipation. I knew, without understanding how, that I was about to encounter the answers to every question I had ever asked. And then, I reached the source of the light. Standing before me was Jesus. There are no words to capture the fullness of his presence. His love radiated from him like a tangible force, enveloping me in its warmth. His eyes, filled with both sorrow and joy, looked into mine, and in that gaze, I felt truly seen for the first time in my life. He knew everything about me, every doubt, every fear, every failure, and yet, his love was unwavering. I didn't need to speak, he understood me completely. He didn't speak with words, but with a voice that resonated directly in my heart. You have sought me in rituals and rules, he said, but I am found in love and grace. You do not need to earn my favor, it is already yours. All you need is to accept the gift I have given you. His words pierced through me, and for the first time, I began to understand. My life had been spent striving, working, and trying to prove my worth, but here was a love that required nothing in return. It was a gift, freely given, and all I had to do was receive it. Jesus continued, I have allowed you to see this so that you may know the truth. Salvation is not through your works, but through faith in me. You cannot earn what has already been paid for. As he spoke, he showed me his life, his teachings, his suffering, his sacrifice on the cross. I saw the weight of the sins he bore, not just for others, but for me personally. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the depth of his love and the enormity of his grace. I have already forgiven you, he said. My grace is sufficient. You are free, not because of what you have done, but because of what I have done for you. At that moment, the chains I had carried for so long, chains of guilt, fear, and striving, fell away. I felt a joy and freedom unlike anything I had ever known. I understood now that faith was not about adhering to a set of rules, but about a relationship with the one who loved me unconditionally. Jesus showed me a glimpse of eternity, a place bathed in light and filled with love, where there was no pain, no sorrow, only peace. This is what I have prepared for you, he said, and for all who believe in me. Then, he showed me the alternative, a place devoid of love, a void where those who rejected him chose to dwell. I realized how close I had been to missing this truth, how my pride and fear had blinded me to the simplicity of his gift. Now, he said, it is time for you to return. Your work is not yet finished. Share what you have seen. Be a light to others, as I have been a light to you. I didn't want to leave his presence, but I understood that my journey was not over. He embraced me, and I felt his love fill every fiber of my being. Go, he said, and remember, I am always with you. The next thing I knew, I was back in my body, lying in the mud and rain. Pain surged through me, but it was a different kind of pain, one I could endure because I knew I wasn't alone. I opened my eyes and saw the faint glow of dawn breaking through the storm clouds. Help arrived soon after, and I was taken to the hospital. The doctors called my survival a miracle, but I knew it was more than that. It was a calling. From that day forward, my life changed completely. I no longer served out of obligation or fear, but out of love and gratitude. I began sharing my story with anyone who would listen, not to glorify myself, but to point others to the grace I had found. Some rejected it, others questioned it, but many were moved, not by my words, but by the truth of the one who had saved me. I stepped away from the rigid structures I had once clung to, finding instead a vibrant community of believers who embraced the simplicity of the gospel. Together, we worshiped, prayed, and shared the love of Christ with the world. My heart, once burdened and weary, was now alive with purpose. I no longer feared failure or rejection because I knew that my worth was not in what I did, but in who I belonged to. And so, I continue on this journey, not as a perfect man, but as a redeemed one. My name is Father Michael, and my heart belongs to Jesus. His love has transformed me, and His grace sustains me. And as long as I have breath, I will share His truth, so that others may come to know the peace and joy that only He can give. For He is the way, the truth, and the life, and in Him I have found my home. The days following my experience were a whirlwind of reflection, healing, and discovery. As I lay in the hospital bed, recovering from my injuries, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, felt, and heard. Every moment replayed in my mind with vivid clarity, the light, the presence of Jesus, His words that pierced my soul. I felt as though I had been reborn, given a second chance not just at life, but at truly understanding what it meant to live. My heart was overflowing with gratitude, but I also felt the weight of the calling Jesus had given me. How could I possibly communicate the enormity of what I had experienced? How could I help others see what had been revealed to me? The first person I told was the attending nurse who came to check my vitals. She was a kind woman with a warm smile, but I could sense a heaviness in her spirit. As she adjusted my she asked, "How are you feeling today, Father?" It was a simple question, but it opened the floodgates. I began to tell her everything, the storm, the fall, the moment I left my body, and my encounter with Jesus. Her eyes widened, and she paused, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the rail of the hospital bed. "I've been struggling with my faith," she admitted quietly. "I've been praying for a sign, for something to remind me that God hasn't forgotten me." Tears welled up in her eyes as I told her about the love and grace I had experienced, about how Jesus had reminded me that His love is for everyone, no matter how lost we feel. We prayed together, and for the first time, I saw how my story could be a light for others. It wasn't about me, it was about pointing people to Him. When I was discharged from the hospital, I returned to my parish with a renewed sense of purpose. Everything felt different now. The rituals I had once performed out of obligation now held a deeper meaning. The prayers I recited were no longer formalities, but heartfelt conversations with a God I now knew personally. And when I stood at the pulpit to deliver my homilies, I spoke not as a man bound by tradition, but as someone who had been set free by grace. At first, my congregation didn't know what to make of the change in me. Some were inspired, others confused, and a few were resistant. There were those who questioned my near-death experience, dismissing it as a hallucination or a product of my injuries. But I didn't let their skepticism deter me. I knew what I had seen and felt, and I knew that it was real. Over time, as I continued to share my story and live out the truth of what I had learned, more and more people began to see the transformation in me and began to seek the same for themselves. One Sunday, after Mass, an older man approached me. His name was George, and he had been a member of the parish for decades. He was known for his stoic demeanor and unwavering adherence to the Church's teachings. But as he stood before me, I saw tears in his eyes. "Father," he said, his voice trembling, "I've spent my whole life trying to be good enough for God. But hearing your story, it's made me realize that I've been missing the point. I want to know the love you've described. I want to experience His grace." We sat together in the pews, and I shared with him the same message Jesus had shared with me, that salvation is not something we earn, but something we receive through faith. George prayed with me that day, surrendering his fears and embracing the gift of grace. It was a moment of profound beauty, and it reminded me once again of the power of God's love to transform even the most hardened hearts. As the months went by, my ministry began to expand beyond the walls of the church. Invitations started coming in from neighboring parishes, community groups, and even secular organizations, all curious to hear my story. At first, I was hesitant. Public speaking had never been my strong suit, and the idea of sharing something so personal with strangers felt daunting. But I remembered Jesus' words, "Share what you have seen. Be a light to others." And so, I stepped out in faith, trusting that He would guide me. The first time I spoke at an event outside my parish, I was overwhelmed by the response. People came forward in droves, sharing their own struggles, doubts, and fears. Many told me they had felt distant from God for years, trapped in cycles of guilt and shame, unsure of how to find their way back. As I listened to their stories, I realized that my experience was not unique. The emptiness I had felt, the doubts that had plagued me, were struggles shared by countless others. And the message of grace that had set me free was exactly what they needed to hear. One evening, after speaking at a community center, a young woman named Emily approached me. She was in her early 20s, her eyes filled with both curiosity and pain. "Father Michael," she said hesitantly, "I grew up in the church, but I left when I was a teenager. I always felt like I could never live up to God's expectations, so I stopped trying. But hearing you talk about grace, it's made me wonder if maybe He hasn't given up on me after all." I smiled, tears welling up in my own eyes. "Emily," I said, "He never gave up on you. His love has been with you every step of the way, waiting for you to come home." We talked for hours that night, and by the end of our conversation, Emily was ready to take the first steps back toward her faith. It was moments like these that reminded me why Jesus had sent me back, to be a vessel of His love and grace, to help others find their way to Him. Not everyone was receptive to my message, of course. There were those who clung tightly to their traditions, who dismissed my experience as heretical or unorthodox. Some accused me of undermining the church's teachings, of leading people astray with my emphasis on grace over works. These criticisms were painful, especially when they came from colleagues and mentors I had once admired. But I held fast to the truth I had been shown. I knew that my calling was not to please men, but to serve God, and I trusted that He would vindicate me in His time. As I continued to share my story, I began to see the ripple effects of God's work. People who had come to hear me speak would go on to share their own testimonies, spreading the message of grace to their families, friends, and communities. Entire families were being transformed, cycles of fear and shame broken by the power of God's love. It was humbling to witness, and it reminded me that the work was His, not mine. I was simply a vessel, and He was the one changing hearts. Through it all, I clung to the promise Jesus had made to me during my near-death experience: "I am always with you." Those words became my anchor, sustaining me through moments of doubt and discouragement. No matter how challenging the road became, I knew that I was never alone. His presence was as real to me now as it had been in the light of His embrace, and it gave me the strength to keep moving forward. As the years passed, my journey led me to places I never could have imagined. I traveled across the country and even to other parts of the world, sharing the message of grace with anyone who would listen. I met people from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, believers and skeptics, all searching for the same thing: the love and hope that can only be found in Jesus. And each time I shared my story, I was reminded of the incredible privilege it was to be a part of His work. Looking back now, I see how God used my brokenness to reveal His glory. The emptiness I once felt, the doubts that nearly consumed me, were not the end of my story, but the beginning of a greater one. Through my struggles, He led me to a deeper understanding of His love, a love that is not earned, but given freely to all who believe. My life is no longer about rituals or perfection, but about a relationship with the One who saved me. My name is Father Michael, and my heart belongs to Jesus. His grace has transformed me, His love sustains me, and His presence guides me every step of the way. My story is not finished, for as long as I have breath, I will continue to share the truth of His gospel. And when my time on this earth comes to an end, I know that I will see Him again, not as a near-death experience, but as the fulfillment of the promise He made to me. Until that day, I will live for Him, love for Him, and proclaim His name, for He is everything. Even as I continue to share my testimony, I realize that this journey is not without its challenges. There are moments when I feel the weight of my humanity, when doubt tries to creep back in, when the voices of critics grow loud, or when I feel inadequate to fulfill the calling Jesus has placed on my life. But in those moments, I return to the truth of His words. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. Those words are not just a comfort, they are my lifeline. One of the most profound challenges I've faced is learning to let go of control. For so many years, my faith had been tied to what I could do, to how well I could follow the rules, perform the rituals, and meet the expectations of others. But now I understand that true faith isn't about control, it's about surrender. It's about trusting God with the things I cannot understand, the questions I cannot answer, and the outcomes I cannot predict. This surrender has brought me a freedom I never thought possible. There was a moment not long after my near-death experience when this lesson became painfully clear. I was invited to speak at a conference for clergy, an event attended by priests, pastors, seminarians, and lay leaders from across the region. I prepared diligently, crafting a message that I hoped would inspire and encourage. But as I stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. What if they didn't believe me? What if they rejected my story? What if my words fell flat? I closed my eyes and prayed, Lord, this is not about me. This is your message, your truth. Use me however you see fit. When I stepped onto the stage, the fear melted away. I spoke from my heart, sharing not just the details of my experience, but the transformation it had brought to my life. I told them about the grace I had found in Jesus, about the freedom that comes from trusting in His love. And as I spoke, I felt His presence with me, guiding my words and touching the hearts of those who listened. Afterward, a young seminarian approached me. His name was Daniel, and he was on the verge of leaving the seminary. Father Michael, he said, I've been struggling with so much doubt. I've felt like I'm not good enough, like I don't belong here. But hearing your story, it's given me hope. It's reminded me that it's not about being perfect, it's about trusting Him. Thank you for that. Tears filled my eyes as I embraced him, knowing that God was working in ways far beyond my understanding. Moments like these remind me why I do what I do. They remind me that my story is not my own, it belongs to Him. And it's not just my story, it's His story, the story of His love and grace reaching into the darkest places to bring light and hope. Every time I see someone's life transformed by that truth, I am reminded of the power of the gospel. It is not just good news, it is the best news, the only news that truly matters. But not every encounter is easy. There are times when I face rejection, when people scoff at my testimony or dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. There are times when I feel the sting of criticism, when colleagues question my motives or accuse me of straying too far from tradition. And there are times when I feel the weight of the brokenness in the world, when I see people clinging to pain, fear, and pride, unable or unwilling to accept the gift of grace. One such moment came during a visit to a prison ministry. I had been invited to speak to a group of inmates, many of whom were serving life sentences. As I stood before them, I could see the pain etched into their faces, the walls they had built around their hearts. I spoke of God's love, of His ability to redeem even the darkest past, but I could sense the resistance in the room. After I finished, one of the inmates, a man named Marcus, stood up. His voice was filled with anger as he said, "How can you stand there and tell us that God loves us? Do you know what we've done? Do you know the kind of people we are?" I looked at Marcus, and my heart broke for him. "Yes, Marcus," I said, "I know that you've made mistakes. We all have. But God's love isn't based on what you've done, it's based on who He is. And who He is love. His grace is greater than your past, greater than your sins, greater than anything you could ever imagine. You don't have to carry this burden anymore. Let Him take it from you." Marcus didn't respond, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps hope. Weeks later, I received a letter from the chaplain of the prison. He told me that Marcus had started attending Bible study and was beginning to open up about his faith. It was a reminder that even when we don't see the results, God is always at work, planting seeds that will grow in His time. As I write this now, I am sitting in my study, surrounded by letters, emails, and messages from people who have been touched by my story. Some are from old friends who have rediscovered their faith, others are from strangers who felt a spark of hope for the first time in years. Each one is a testament to the power of God's grace, a reminder that He is still in the business of changing lives. But this journey is not just about others, it's also about my own ongoing transformation. Every day, I am learning to trust Him more, to rely on His strength instead of my own. I am learning to see myself not through the lens of my past failures, but through the lens of His love. And I am learning that my worth is not in what I do, but in who I am as His child. One of the greatest joys of this journey has been the people I've met along the way. From the small-town pastor who invited me to speak at his church to the single mother who shared her story of finding hope in the midst of despair, each person has reminded me of the beauty of God's kingdom. It is a kingdom not of power or prestige, but of love, humility, and grace. And it is a kingdom that is open to all who believe. Looking back, I see how every step of my journey has been preparing me for this moment. The doubts, the struggles, the near-death experience, they were all part of His plan to draw me closer to Him and to equip me to share His message with the world. I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. And that is enough. As I close this chapter of my story, I do so with a heart full of gratitude. Gratitude for the love that saved me, the grace that sustains me, and the calling that gives my life purpose. My name is Father Michael, and my story is not about me, it's about Him. It's about the God who takes broken vessels and uses them to pour out His love on a broken world. It's about the Savior who gave His life so that we might live. And it's about the grace that is available to everyone, no matter who you are or where you've been. This is the story I will continue to tell, for as long as I have breath. This is the truth I will proclaim, with every word, every action, and every ounce of my being. And when my time on this earth comes to an end, I know that I will stand before Him once more, not as a man burdened by fear and doubt, but as a child redeemed by His love. Until that day, I will live for Him, love for Him, and share His grace with the world. For He is my Savior, my Redeemer, my everything. And in Him, I have found my home. Even as I write these words, I find myself reflecting on the profound simplicity of what Jesus taught me, that His love is always enough. It's a truth that seems so basic, yet it's something that so many, including myself for so long, struggle to accept. We live in a world where we are taught to earn everything: success, respect, approval. But the love of Jesus turns that upside down. It isn't earned, it's given, freely and unconditionally. And the more I share this truth, the more I see how desperately the world needs to hear it. There was one moment that etched this even deeper into my heart. I was invited to speak at a youth conference in a small Midwestern town. Hundreds of teenagers filled the church hall, some there by choice, others because their parents had insisted. As I looked out over the crowd, I saw a mix of curiosity, indifference, and even a little defiance. I prayed silently, asking God to give me the words they needed to hear. I began by sharing my story, the near-death experience that had changed my life, but I also talked about the emptiness I had felt before that moment, the doubts, the fears, the feeling of not being good enough. I told them how Jesus had met me in that brokenness and filled the void with His love. As I spoke, I noticed a young girl near the back of the room. She was slouched in her chair, her arms crossed, her eyes avoiding mine. But as I continued, I saw her posture change. She sat up a little straighter, her arms fell to her sides, and by the end, tears were streaming down her face. After the session, she came up to me, hesitating as though she wasn't sure if she should speak. "Father Michael," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "I didn't think God could love someone like me. I've made so many mistakes, and I've felt so alone. But when you talked about grace, it felt like you were talking to me." I looked at her, my own eyes filling with tears. "He does love you," I said. "More than you can possibly imagine." And nothing you've done can ever change that. His grace is greater than your past, greater than your mistakes. All you have to do is accept it. We prayed together, and in that moment, I saw the weight she had been carrying begin to lift. It was a reminder to me that no one is beyond the reach of His love. The more I share my story, the more I see how universal the struggle is. People from all walks of life, young and old, rich and poor, devout and skeptical, are searching for the same thing: a love that is real, a hope that doesn't fade, a purpose that goes beyond the here and now. And every time I share the message of grace, I see that hunger in their eyes. It's a hunger I know well because it's the same hunger that drove me to my knees so many times before I truly understood what Jesus had done for me. Not long ago, I received a letter from a man named Robert. He was a retired Marine, a man who had seen more pain and loss than most of us can imagine. In his letter, he wrote about the guilt he carried, the lives he had taken in combat, the friends he had lost, the family he had pushed away because he didn't know how to deal with his pain. He told me that he had heard my story on a podcast and that it had stirred something in him. "I've spent my whole life trying to atone for the things I've done," he wrote. "But for the first time, I'm starting to believe that maybe I don't have to. Maybe Jesus already did that for me." I wrote back to Robert, sharing more about the truth of grace and inviting him to continue the conversation. Over the months that followed, we exchanged letters, and I saw a transformation begin to take place in him. The man who had once been weighed down by guilt and shame was starting to walk in freedom. He told me that he had joined a local church and was even leading a Bible study for other veterans. His story was a powerful reminder that no one is too far gone for God's love to reach them. Of course, there are still moments when I struggle. There are days when the weight of the world feels overwhelming, when I see so much pain and brokenness that it's hard to hold on to hope. There are moments when I question whether I'm making a difference, whether my words are really reaching anyone. But in those moments, I return to the memory of Jesus' embrace, to the truth He spoke to me: "You are not alone. I am always with you." It's a promise that sustains me, even in the darkest times. One particularly challenging season came when I lost someone very dear to me, a close friend and mentor who had been like a father to me. His death was sudden and unexpected, and it shook me to my core. For weeks, I wrestled with grief and doubt, questioning why God had taken him and why He allowed suffering in the lives of those who loved Him. But in the midst of my pain, I felt a gentle reminder: "My grace is sufficient for you." It didn't take away the sorrow, but it gave me the strength to keep going, to trust that even in loss, God's love remains steadfast. In the years since my near-death experience, my life has become a tapestry of stories of redemption, transformation, and grace. Each person I meet, each testimony I hear, adds another thread to that tapestry, weaving a picture of a God who never stops pursuing His children. And though my own story is only one small part of that greater picture, I am humbled and grateful to play a role in it. As I write these words, I am reminded of a verse that has become a cornerstone of my faith: "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God." Ephesians 2 verse 8. This verse encapsulates everything I have learned, everything I now live for. It is not about what we do, it is about what He has done. It is not about our worthiness, it is about His love. And it is not about earning salvation, it is about receiving the gift that has already been given. My name is Father Michael, and my story is still being written. But one thing I know for certain: it is a story of grace. It is a story of a love that found me when I was lost, lifted me when I was broken, and gave me a purpose I could never have imagined. And it is a story that I will continue to tell, for as long as I have breath. For His grace is sufficient, His love is unending, and His promise is true. And in Him, I have found everything I was searching for. As the years unfold, I find myself continually amazed by the ways God works through the simplest moments, the smallest gestures, and the most unexpected encounters. The journey I began after my near-death experience has not been without its challenges, but it has been marked by a constant thread of grace that weaves through everything I do. Each step I take feels like part of a divine plan, one I cannot fully understand, but trust with all my heart. One of the most profound lessons I've learned is that sharing the message of grace often starts with listening. People carry burdens that are invisible to the outside world, wounds they're too afraid to show, doubts they're too ashamed to voice. When I sit down with someone, whether it's a stranger at a coffee shop or a parishioner after Mass, I've learned to ask, "How are you, really?" It's a simple question, but one that opens the door to conversations that often reveal the deepest parts of their hearts. I remember one such conversation vividly. A man named Peter came to see me after a service one Sunday. He was in his late 40s, with tired eyes and a demeanor that suggested he hadn't slept well in weeks. He sat across from me in my office, his hands fidgeting nervously. After a long silence, he finally said, "I don't know why I'm here. I don't know where else to go." As he began to share his story, I learned that Peter had recently lost his job and was struggling to provide for his family. But beneath the surface, there was a deeper pain, a sense of failure that had been eating away at him for years. "I've always felt like I wasn't enough," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Not as a husband, not as a father, not as a man. And now, I just feel like I've let everyone down." I listened quietly, praying for wisdom as he poured out his heart. When he finished, I said, "Peter, I want you to know something. Your worth is not defined by your job, your achievements, or even your mistakes. Your worth comes from the fact that you are a child of God, deeply loved by Him. And nothing, absolutely nothing, can change that." Tears streamed down his face as he looked at me, as though he were hearing those words for the first time. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. "I don't just believe it," I replied. "I know it. Because I've been where you are, feeling like I wasn't enough, like I had to earn God's love. But I've learned that His love isn't something we earn. It's a gift. And it's already yours." We prayed together that day, and I saw a glimmer of hope return to his eyes. Over the weeks that followed, Peter began attending a men's group at the church, where he found a community that supported and encouraged him. He found a new job, but more importantly, he found a renewed sense of purpose and identity, not in what he did, but in who he was as a beloved child of God. Stories like Peter's remind me that grace is not just a concept, it's a lifeline. It's the thread that connects us to God and to one another, the evidence of His love at work in the messy, broken realities of our lives. And as I continue to share this message, I see its transformative power again and again, not because of anything I do, but because of who He is. One of the most unexpected blessings of this journey has been the opportunity to reach people far beyond the walls of the church. Through invitations to speak, interviews, and even social media, I've been able to share my story with audiences I never would have imagined. At first, this felt overwhelming. How could I, just one man with a story, make any difference in a world so vast and full of noise? But then I remembered the parable of the mustard seed, how something so small can grow into something so much greater. And I entrusted my story to God, trusting that He would use it in ways I couldn't foresee. One day, I received an email from a woman named Sandra. She had stumbled upon a recording of one of my talks while scrolling through the internet late at night. In her email, she shared how she had been battling depression for years, feeling isolated and unloved. "I was ready to give up," she wrote, "but something about your words made me pause. You talked about how Jesus meets us in our brokenness, how His grace is enough even when we feel like we aren't. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe that could be true for me." Sandra and I exchanged emails for months, and she eventually found the courage to visit a local church, where she connected with a community that welcomed her with open arms. She told me later that hearing my story had been the nudge she needed to take that first step. Her words humbled me deeply, reminding me that it's not about the size of the audience or the platform, it's about the individual lives touched by God's love. But as much as I've seen the beauty of grace in action, I've also been confronted with the reality of spiritual warfare. The enemy does not take kindly to lives being transformed, and there have been moments when I've felt the weight of opposition, times when doubts creep in, when relationships are strained, when the path ahead seems unclear. In those moments, I've learned to lean on the promises of God, to anchor myself in His Word, and surround myself with a community of believers who pray for and encourage me. One particularly difficult season came when I was invited to speak at a university known for its skepticism of faith. The event was billed as a dialogue between faith and reason, and I knew going in that my story would be met with scrutiny, if not outright hostility. As I stood before the crowd, I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the crossed arms and furrowed brows. But I also saw something else: curiosity. A desire, however faint, to know if what I was saying could possibly be true. I began by sharing my story, not as a preacher but as a fellow traveler on this journey of life. I talked about my doubts, my struggles, and the emptiness I had felt even in the midst of my religious devotion. And then I told them about Jesus, about the love and grace that had changed everything for me. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, a young man in the front row raised his hand. "I don't believe in God," he said bluntly. "But what you're saying, it sounds different than what I've heard before. You're saying it's not about rules or judgment, but about love. Why would God love someone like me?" I looked at him, my heart aching for the pain I sensed behind his words. "Because that's who He is," I said simply. "God's love isn't conditional. It's not based on what you've done or haven't done. It's based on who He is. And who He is love." After the event, that young man stayed behind to talk. His name was Andrew, and he shared with me how he had grown up in a home where faith was used as a weapon, a tool for control and condemnation. "If what you're saying is true," he said, "then maybe I've been looking at God all wrong." Andrew and I kept in touch after that night, and over time, I saw his heart begin to soften. He started asking questions, reading the Bible, and exploring what it might mean to have a relationship with God. His journey is still unfolding, but I believe with all my heart that the seeds of grace have been planted in him. As I reflect on these stories and so many others, I am reminded of the profound truth that God's grace is for everyone. It doesn't matter how far we've wandered, how broken we feel, or how unworthy we believe we are. His love is relentless, His arms are open, and His invitation is always there. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11 verse 28. My name is Father Michael, and my journey is far from over. But as I continue to walk this path, one thing remains constant: the love of Jesus, the grace that saved me, and the calling to share that truth with the world. I don't know what lies ahead, but I know who walks beside me. And in Him, I have found everything I need. As I continue to walk this path, I find that the journey deepens in ways I could never have anticipated. The simplicity of Jesus' message, His love, His grace, His call to come and follow, continues to anchor me, but the landscapes of faith I encounter are vast and varied. Each day brings new faces, new stories, and new revelations of how God's love reaches into the darkest corners of our lives to bring light. One of the most humbling aspects of this journey has been seeing how God works in the lives of people I least expected to encounter. A few months ago, I was invited to speak at a rehabilitation center for individuals recovering from addiction. I had never worked closely with people in such circumstances before, and I felt a mixture of nervousness and inadequacy as I prepared to meet them. What could I possibly say to people who had faced such profound struggles? What could I offer to men and women who had endured years of pain, guilt, and brokenness? When I arrived, I was greeted by the program director, a man named Joseph, who had himself been through the program years earlier. His warm smile and firm handshake put me at ease, but I could see the weight of his past in his eyes. "These people," he told me as we walked toward the meeting room, "are looking for hope. They've heard a lot of talk before, about change, about recovery, about turning their lives around. But what they need isn't more talk. They need something real." As I stepped into the room, I was struck by the rawness of the moment. About 30 individuals sat in a circle, their faces a mix of weariness, skepticism, and quiet desperation. I could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air: "What can you possibly offer me?" I took a deep breath, silently praying for God's guidance, and began to share my story. I told them about the emptiness I had felt even as a man of faith, about the doubts that had plagued me, and about the moment when Jesus met me in my brokenness and changed everything. I didn't sugarcoat my words or try to present myself as someone who had it all together. I was honest about my struggles, my fears, and my failures. And I told them about the grace that had set me free, not because I deserved it, but because God's love is greater than anything we can imagine. As I spoke, I saw the skepticism in their eyes begin to soften. One man, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the floor, slowly lifted his head and looked at me. A woman near the back wiped away tears as she listened. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, one by one, they began to share their own stories. A man named Carlos spoke first. His voice was rough, his words halting, but his honesty was undeniable. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he said. "I've hurt people I love. And I've always thought that I was too far gone for God to care about me. But maybe I've been wrong." Another woman, Sarah, shared how she had grown up in a Christian home but had turned away from her faith after years of feeling like she could never measure up. "Hearing you talk about grace," she said, "it's like a light bulb went off in my head. Maybe it's not about measuring up. Maybe it's about letting Him love me, even when I don't feel worthy." By the end of the evening, I felt as though I had witnessed a miracle. These men and women, who had come into the room carrying the weight of their pasts, were beginning to see that their stories weren't over, that God's grace was big enough to rewrite even the darkest chapters of their lives. As we closed in prayer, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for what God was doing in their lives, but for allowing me to be a small part of it. Since that night, I've stayed in touch with Joseph and the team at the rehabilitation center. They've shared updates about how some of the individuals I met are progressing in their recovery, not just physically and emotionally, but spiritually as well. Carlos has started attending a local church and has reconnected with his family. Sarah is volunteering at the center, helping others find hope just as she did. Their stories are living proof that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. But even as I celebrate these moments of transformation, I am reminded that the work is far from finished. The world is filled with so much pain, so much brokenness, and so many people who feel lost and alone. There are days when the enormity of it all feels overwhelming, when I wonder if my efforts are making any difference. But in those moments, I return to the truth that has carried me through every challenge. It's not about me. It's about Him. And He is always enough. One evening, as I sat alone in my study, I received a phone call from a man named James. He had heard about me through a mutual friend and wanted to talk. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as he explained that he was calling from a hospice facility. He had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and had only weeks to live. "I don't know why I'm calling you," he said. "I guess. I just don't want to die without knowing if there's really a God who loves me." My heart broke as I listened to him, and I knew this was one of those moments when words alone wouldn't be enough. I asked if I could come visit him, and he agreed. The next day, I sat by his bedside, holding his frail hand as he shared his fears and regrets. He talked about the mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt, and the years he had spent running from God. "James," I said gently, "you don't have to run anymore. God's love is right here, right now. It's been with you all along, waiting for you to turn to Him. And it's not too late. His grace is greater than anything you've done, and His arms are open wide." Tears streamed down his face as he asked, "Do you really think He can forgive me?" "I don't just think it," I said. "I know it. Because I've experienced it myself. And because Jesus promised it. Whoever comes to me, I will never cast out." John 6 verse 37. In that moment, James surrendered his heart to God. He prayed with a sincerity that brought tears to my own eyes, asking Jesus to forgive him, to love him, and to welcome him home. The peace that came over him was almost tangible. In the days that followed, I visited him often, and though his body grew weaker, his spirit grew stronger. When he passed away, I knew without a doubt that he was in the presence of the Savior who had been waiting for him all along. Stories like James's remind me that every moment matters. Every conversation, every prayer, every act of love, it all matters in the grand tapestry of God's plan. And though I may never see the full picture, I trust that He is weaving something beautiful, something eternal. My name is Father Michael, and my story is still being written. But one thing remains constant: the love of Jesus, the grace that saved me, and the calling to share that truth with every soul I encounter. Each day is a gift, an opportunity to point people to the one who is the source of all hope, all joy, and all life. And as long as I have breath, I will continue to share his story, for it is the greatest story ever told. As I continue to reflect on this calling, I've come to accept that not every chapter of this journey will be easy, nor will every outcome be what I hope for. There have been moments of deep discouragement, times when my attempts to share the message of grace seem to fall on deaf ears, or when I encounter resistance that feels insurmountable. Yet, even in the face of such trials, I've learned to hold tightly to the truth that God's work is never in vain. One such trial came during a mission trip to a distant city, where I was invited to speak at a public forum on faith and forgiveness. The event was held in a community deeply divided by political and social tensions, and the air in the room felt charged with unspoken hostility. I could sense that many of the attendees had come not to listen, but to challenge and confront. My heart was heavy as I took the stage, knowing that the message I carried might not be welcomed. I began by sharing my story, as I often do, focusing on the grace that had transformed my life and the love of Jesus that is available to all. But as I spoke, I noticed a man in the front row shaking his head, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. When I finished, he was the first to stand and speak. "Father Michael," he said, his voice sharp and filled with anger, "you talk about grace and forgiveness like they're easy. But what about those of us who have been hurt, really hurt? What about the people who have betrayed us, abused us, destroyed our lives? Are you saying we're just supposed to forgive them and move on? Because if that's what you're selling, I'm not buying it." The room fell silent, all eyes on me. I could feel the weight of his pain, the bitterness that had taken root in his heart. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But then I remembered the words of Jesus, "Forgive, and you will be forgiven," Luke 6 verse 37. I took a deep breath and spoke as gently as I could. "Forgiveness is not easy," I said. "And it's not something we can do on our own. It's a process, one that begins with a decision to let go of the anger and pain that hold us captive. But forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what was done to you, and it doesn't mean forgetting. It means releasing the burden to God and trusting Him to bring justice in His time. And it's not just for the person who hurt you, it's for you, to set your heart free." The man stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sat down without another word. I wasn't sure if anything I'd said had reached him, but I prayed silently that God would work in his heart. After the event, as I was gathering my things to leave, the man approached me. His anger seemed to have softened, replaced by a quiet sadness. "I don't know if I can do what you're saying," he admitted. "But maybe I can try." We talked for nearly an hour, and he shared the story of the betrayal that had left him so wounded. I listened, offering what little comfort I could, and encouraged him to take his pain to God in prayer. He didn't make any grand declarations of faith that day, but as he walked away, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It was a reminder that even the smallest steps can lead to transformation. Encounters like this have taught me the importance of patience and persistence. Sometimes, the seeds we plant take time to grow, and we may never see the full harvest. But our role is not to control the outcome, it's to be faithful in sharing the message, trusting that God will do the rest. In the years since my near-death experience, I've also come to see how God uses our own struggles and failures to shape us for His purposes. There was a time when I believed that being a priest meant presenting a facade of perfection, hiding my weaknesses and doubts from the world. But now I understand that it is in our weakness that His strength is made perfect, 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. My struggles have become a bridge, allowing me to connect with others in their pain and point them to the one who offers healing. This truth became especially evident during a retreat I led for a group of young adults. The theme was finding God in the midst of doubt, and I shared openly about my own journey through seasons of uncertainty and fear. After one of the sessions, a young woman named Elena approached me. She was quiet and reserved, but there was a depth in her eyes that spoke of an inner battle. Father Michael, she said hesitantly, I've been struggling with doubt for so long. I want to believe, but I just don't feel anything. When I pray, it feels like I'm talking to an empty room. I don't know if God is even there. Her words brought me back to my own dark nights of the soul, the times when I had knelt in prayer and felt nothing but silence. I told her about those moments, about how I had learned that faith is not a feeling but a choice to trust in God's presence and promises, even when we can't see or feel Him. Elena, I said, even when it feels like God is far away, He is closer than you can imagine. Sometimes, the silence is an invitation to lean in, to trust Him more deeply. And even when you don't have the words to pray, the Spirit intercedes for you with groans too deep for words. Romans 8 verse 26. You are not alone. We prayed together, and as she wept, I saw a glimpse of the healing that was beginning to take place. She later told me that our conversation had given her the courage to keep seeking God, even in the midst of her doubt. It was a reminder to me that faith is often forged in the fire of our struggles, and that God's grace is sufficient to carry us through. As I continue this journey, I am deeply aware of my own limitations. I am not a perfect man, nor a perfect priest. I make mistakes, I wrestle with my own fears and insecurities, and I often feel inadequate for the task before me. But I take comfort in the knowledge that it is not my strength or wisdom that matters, it is His. And He is faithful. My name is Father Michael, and my story is still unfolding. It is a story of grace, of redemption, and of a love that has no end. Each day is a new chapter, filled with challenges, joys, and opportunities to share the truth that has changed my life. And as long as I have breath, I will continue to proclaim that truth, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that His love is more than enough for all who seek it. When my time on this earth comes to an end, I hope to leave behind not a legacy of accomplishments, but a trail of lives touched by His grace. And as I step into eternity, I know I will hear the words I long for most, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord, Matthew 25 verse 23. Until that day, I will walk this path with faith, hope, and love, trusting in the one who is writing the story of my life. For His glory, and for the sake of His kingdom, I will press on. And in Him, I have found my home, my purpose, and my forever. As I continue to live out this journey, I am reminded daily that my calling is not about grand gestures or dramatic transformations alone. It is about faithfulness in the small, ordinary moments. The love of Jesus is not confined to pulpits, conferences, or public forums. It is most powerfully expressed in the quiet, unseen acts of kindness, and the everyday encounters where grace is shared and hearts are touched. One of the most profound lessons I've learned is that ministry happens everywhere, not just in churches or formal gatherings, but in coffee shops, grocery stores, hospital rooms, and even on busy street corners. One afternoon, as I was walking through the park near my parish, I noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench. He was hunched over, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a tattered photograph. Something about his posture, his quiet stillness amidst the movement of the world around him, drew me to him. I approached gently, not wanting to startle him, and asked if I could sit beside him. He nodded without looking up, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "It's my wife," he said quietly, as though answering a question I hadn't asked. "She passed away 5 years ago, but I come here every day to talk to her. This was her favorite spot." His voice was heavy with grief, but there was a tenderness in the way he spoke of her, a love that had not diminished with time. I sat with him for a long while, listening as he shared stories of their life together, their joys, their struggles, the little moments that had made their love so special. He spoke of how her faith had been unshakable, even in her final days, and how she had always told him that God's love would sustain him when she was gone. "But I don't feel it," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I try to pray, but all I feel is the emptiness. I don't know if He's really there." I placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Sometimes, the silence feels unbearable. But even in the silence, God is with us. He sees your pain, He hears your prayers, and He holds you in His love, even when you can't feel it. You're not alone." We prayed together there on the bench, and as he wept, I felt the presence of God enveloping us both. It was a simple moment, one that would never make headlines or be remembered by anyone but the two of us. Yet, in that moment, I saw the power of grace at work, the tender, quiet grace that meets us in our deepest sorrows and whispers, "I am here." In the weeks that followed, the man, whose name I learned was Walter, began attending Mass at the parish. He still carried his grief, but there was a new lightness in his step, a quiet hope that hadn't been there before. He told me once, after communion, "I still talk to her when I sit on that bench. But now, I talk to him too. And for the first time, I feel like maybe he's listening." Moments like these remind me that ministry is not about numbers or accolades. It's about being present, truly present, with the people God places in our path. It's about meeting them where they are, listening to their stories, and pointing them to the one who loves them more than they can imagine. It's about planting seeds of hope, even in the soil of despair, and trusting God to bring the growth. But as much as I try to offer hope to others, I am continually reminded of my own need for that same grace. There are days when my own doubts resurface, when the weight of the world's brokenness feels overwhelming, or when I fall short of the love and patience I strive to embody. In those moments, I am tempted to retreat into self-condemnation, to question whether I am truly worthy of the calling I've been given. Yet, it is in those moments of weakness that I hear the gentle voice of Jesus, reminding me of the truth he spoke to me during my near-death experience: "You are loved, not for what you do, but for who you are." These words are my anchor, a reminder that my worth is not in my performance but in his love. And as I rest in that love, I find the strength to continue, not because I am strong, but because he is. One of the most unexpected blessings of this journey has been the relationships I've formed with people from all walks of life, people who have challenged me, encouraged me, and shown me new facets of God's grace. There's a young couple in my parish, Maria and David, who have become like family to me. They came to me for premarital counseling, uncertain and nervous about the journey ahead, but their love and commitment to each other were evident. Over the months, I've had the privilege of walking with them through the joys and challenges of their first year of marriage, witnessing their growth not just as a couple but as individuals seeking to honor God in their lives. Maria recently shared with me how they've started hosting a small group for other young couples, creating a space for honest conversations about faith, relationships, and the struggles of daily life. "We just want to share what we've learned," she said, "and remind people that they're not alone in this." Her words brought tears to my eyes as I realized how God was multiplying the seeds of grace I had planted in their hearts. As I look back on the years since my near-death experience, I am struck by how much I have learned, not just about God, but about myself, about others, and about what it means to truly live out the gospel. I've learned that grace is not just a concept to be understood, it's a reality to be lived. It's the thread that connects us to one another, the light that shines in the darkest places, and the strength that carries us through every trial. My name is Father Michael, and my story is still unfolding. It is a story of hope, of redemption, and of a love that never fails. And as long as I have breath, I will continue to share that story, not because it is mine, but because it is his. For it is his love that has transformed me, his grace that sustains me, and his presence that walks with me every step of the way. When my journey on this earth comes to an end, I hope to leave behind not a legacy, but a trail of lives touched by his light. And when I finally stand before him, I know that every tear, every struggle, and every moment of doubt will fade in the radiance of his glory. Until that day, I will press on, trusting in the one who is writing my story and holding fast to the truth that has brought me this far. His grace is sufficient, his love is unending, and his promises are true. For in him, I have found my beginning, my purpose, and my forever. As I near the conclusion of this story, I feel an overwhelming sense of peace, a peace that no words can fully describe. My journey, though still ongoing, has brought me to a place of clarity about what truly matters in this life. It isn't about achievements or accolades, nor is it about avoiding pain or failure. It is about love, his love, and how that love changes everything. I have often thought back to the moment of my near-death experience, the instant when I felt the presence of Jesus so intimately that it shattered every doubt I had ever held. That moment wasn't just a turning point in my life, it was a glimpse of eternity, a reminder of the home that awaits us all. And it has shaped every step I've taken since. In the years that have followed, I've witnessed miracles both large and small. I've seen lives transformed, hearts mended, and faith rekindled in ways that only God could orchestrate. But I've also learned that not every story ends with a neat resolution. There are prayers that go unanswered in the ways we expect, relationships that remain strained, and wounds that take a lifetime to heal. Yet, even in those moments, I have seen the quiet persistence of His grace, working in ways we may not understand until we reach eternity. One of the most profound lessons I've learned is that life is not about avoiding suffering but about finding God's presence in the midst of it. I've walked with people through unimaginable pain, parents grieving the loss of a child, individuals battling terminal illness, families torn apart by conflict, and in every case, I've seen how His love meets us in our deepest sorrows. It doesn't always take the pain away, but it gives us the strength to endure, the hope to keep going, and the promise that we are never alone. Recently, I had the privilege of baptizing the newborn son of Maria and David, the young couple I mentioned earlier. They named him Gabriel, after the angel who brings good news. As I held him in my arms and poured the water over his tiny head, I was struck by the beauty of the moment, a new life, dedicated to God, surrounded by a community of love and faith. It was a reminder that even in a world full of brokenness, new beginnings are always possible. Moments like that fill me with gratitude for the life I've been given, a life that was spared not for my own sake, but so that I could share the message of His grace with others. I often think of the people I've met along the way: Walter, who found peace in his grief; Carlos, who discovered hope in the midst of addiction; Elena, who learned to trust God even in her doubts; and James, who found salvation in his final days. Each of their stories is a testament to the power of God's love, a love that never gives up on us, no matter how far we've wandered. But as much as I've been able to give, I've received so much more in return. The people I've ministered to have taught me about courage, resilience, and the beauty of vulnerability. They've reminded me that we are all works in progress, each of us on a journey of faith that is as unique as the fingerprints God has placed on our hands. And they've shown me that grace is not just something we receive, it's something we are called to extend to others, and every word we speak, every action we take, and every life we touch. As I write these final words, I am sitting in the chapel of my parish, the soft glow of candlelight casting gentle shadows on the walls. The crucifix above the altar catches my eye, and I am reminded once again of the depth of His love, the love that gave everything so that we might have life. It is a love that calls us to follow, not out of obligation, but out of joy. A love that invites us to be His hands and feet in a world that so desperately needs hope. I know that my time on this earth is finite. None of us knows how many days we have, but I no longer fear the end. When my journey here is complete, I know that I will step into the arms of the one who has walked with me every step of the way. And I will hear the words that have guided me through so many seasons of doubt and struggle: you are loved, not for what you do, but for who you are. Until that day comes, I will continue to live out this calling, however imperfectly, trusting that He will use my story for His glory. My name is Father Michael, and though my story is nearing its earthly conclusion, it is a story that will continue in eternity. For His grace is sufficient, His love is unending, and His promise is true. And so, I leave you with this: wherever you are, whatever you've done, and whatever burdens you carry, know that His grace is for you. It is a gift, freely given, waiting for you to receive it. And when you do, you will find what I have found, not just a reason to live, but a hope that will carry you into forever. To Him be the glory, now and always. Amen.